When the castle's most decorated guard discovers the young heir struggling with an eating disorder and severe anxiety attacks, both their lives change forever. What begins as a duty to protect becomes a journey of healing, courage, and discovering that true strength isn't about being perfect. It's about facing your fears and asking for help. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the marble floors of Aldoria Castle as Captain Marcus Thorne made his routine rounds through the royal wing. His polished boots echoed rhythmically against the stone corridors, a sound that had become as familiar to the castle residents as the morning bell tower chimes. For 15 years, Marcus had served as the head of the royal guard, protecting 3 generations of the Aldorian royal family with unwavering dedication. At 38, Marcus possessed the bearing of a man who had seen both triumph and tragedy. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his green eyes held the wisdom that came from years of service. Today, however, something felt different. The castle seemed unusually quiet, even for the early morning hours. As Marcus approached the east wing where Prince Alexander's chambers were located, he noticed the absence of the usual morning activities. Normally, by this time, the young prince would be up and about, either in the library with his tutors or in the training yards practicing swordsmanship. The silence struck Marcus as odd, particularly since today marked the beginning of Prince Alexander's final month of preparation before his 18th birthday celebration and official coronation as heir apparent. Prince Alexander Aldwin Blackthorne was not like most royals his age. Where other young nobles might spend their time in leisure and luxury, Alexander was known throughout the kingdom for his serious nature and dedication to his future responsibilities. He had always been a bright child, excelling in his studies and showing remarkable insight into matters of state. However, over the past several months, Marcus had noticed subtle changes in the prince's behavior that concerned him. The prince had become increasingly withdrawn, often skipping meals and spending long hours alone in his chambers. When he did appear for official functions, his usual vibrant energy seemed dimmed, and his clothes appeared looser than before. Several servants had quietly mentioned to Marcus that they were worried about the prince's health, but royal protocol prevented them from speaking directly about their concerns. Marcus paused outside Alexander's door, listening for any sounds from within. The ornate wooden door, carved with the royal crest of Aldoria, remained silent. Usually he could hear the prince moving about, perhaps reading aloud as he often did when studying, or the sound of quill against parchment as he worked on correspondence. Today, there was nothing. After a moment's hesitation, Marcus knocked gently on the door. "Your Highness, it's Captain Thorne. I wanted to check on your morning schedule." His voice carried the respectful tone he had perfected over years of service, but underneath lay a growing concern. No response came from within the room. Marcus frowned, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the pommel of his sword. In all his years of service, he had developed an almost supernatural sense for when something was wrong. That sense was screaming at him now. He knocked again, this time more firmly. "Prince Alexander, are you well? Your morning tutors are waiting in the library." Still silence. The captain's training kicked in. Royal protocol dictated that he should not enter the prince's private chambers without permission, but his duty to protect overrode such concerns when there might be danger. Marcus tried the door handle and found it locked. This was unusual, as Alexander rarely locked his door during the day. Using the master key that he carried for emergencies, Marcus unlocked the door and stepped inside. The prince's chambers were elegantly appointed with rich tapestries depicting the history of Aldoria, a large 4-poster bed with deep blue curtains, and tall windows that normally let in abundant natural light. Today, however, those windows were covered by heavy drapes, casting the room in an unnatural twilight. "Your Highness," Marcus called softly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He could see the outline of someone sitting on the edge of the bed, hunched over with their head in their hands. As Marcus moved closer, he could see that it was indeed Prince Alexander, but the young man looked far different from the composed royal he usually presented to the world. Alexander's normally perfectly groomed dark hair was disheveled. His nightclothes were wrinkled as if he had slept poorly, and his shoulders shook slightly as if he were struggling to breathe. "Your Highness, what's wrong?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. He had known Alexander since the prince was a small child, and while he had always maintained proper royal protocol, there was a genuine affection between them that went beyond mere duty. Alexander looked up, and Marcus was shocked by what he saw. The prince's face was pale and gaunt, his cheeks hollow in a way that spoke of prolonged poor eating. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, which were red-rimmed as if he had been crying. But what truly alarmed Marcus was the look of sheer panic in the young man's gaze. "I can't breathe," Alexander whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't. I can't do this anymore, Marcus. The weight of it all, it's crushing me." Marcus immediately recognized the signs of what the court physicians called an anxiety attack. He had seen similar episodes among soldiers before major battles, and he knew how to respond. Moving slowly so as not to startle the prince further, Marcus knelt down beside the bed, bringing himself to Alexander's eye level. "Listen to my voice, Your Highness," Marcus said in a calm, steady tone. "You're safe. You're in your chambers, and I'm here with you. Can you try to breathe with me? In slowly through your nose, hold it for a count of 4, then out through your mouth." Alexander tried to follow the instructions, but his breathing remained rapid and shallow. His hands were trembling, and Marcus noticed how thin his wrists had become. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The prince was not just struggling emotionally, but physically as well. "Have you eaten anything today?" Marcus asked gently. Alexander shook his head weakly. "I tried, but I couldn't keep anything down. Every time I think about the coronation, about all the people depending on me, about becoming king someday, I feel sick. I feel like I'm drowning." Marcus felt his heart break for the young man who had been carrying such a burden alone. Alexander had always been mature for his age, taking his responsibilities seriously, but somewhere along the way, that sense of duty had become an overwhelming weight that was crushing his spirit and his health. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I don't remember," Alexander admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe 3 days ago, food just. It makes me feel worse. And then I feel guilty for not eating, which makes me feel even worse, and it just keeps going in circles." The captain's mind raced as he processed this information. The prince was clearly suffering from what the court physicians might call melancholia, combined with what appeared to be a serious problem with eating. This was far beyond anything Marcus had been trained to handle as a guard, but his protective instincts demanded that he do something to help. "Your Highness," Marcus said carefully, "I think we need to get you some help, not just for today, but real help. You shouldn't have to carry this burden alone." Alexander's eyes widened with fear. "No, please. If the court finds out that I'm weak, that I can't handle being heir to the throne, they'll think I'm unfit to rule. My father will be disappointed. The people will lose faith in me." "You're not weak," Marcus said firmly. "You're 17 years old and you're dealing with pressures that would break most grown men. Asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom." But Alexander was already shaking his head. "You don't understand. Everyone expects me to be perfect. To be like my grandfather who led us through the war, or my father who brought prosperity to the kingdom. I'm supposed to be this great leader, but I can't even get through a day without falling apart." Marcus studied the young prince's face and saw something that reminded him of his own younger self. Years ago, when he had first joined the Royal Guard, Marcus had struggled with similar feelings of inadequacy. The pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness, had nearly destroyed him until an older guard had taken him under his wing and taught him that true strength came from acknowledging your limitations and working to overcome them. "Alexander," Marcus said, using the prince's first name for the first time in years, "may I tell you a story?" The prince looked up, surprised by the informal address, but nodded slightly. "When I was first appointed to the Royal Guard, I was about your age. I thought I had to be perfect, never make mistakes, never show fear. I pushed myself so hard that I made myself sick. I wasn't eating properly, wasn't sleeping, was constantly on edge. One day, during a particularly important ceremony, I fainted right in front of your grandfather." Alexander's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of interest breaking through his despair. "I was mortified," Marcus continued. "I thought my career was over, that I had disgraced myself and the royal family. But your grandfather, King Edmund, didn't dismiss me. Instead, he sat me down and told me something I'll never forget. He said that a leader who has never struggled cannot truly understand the struggles of his people. He said that my humanity, including my weaknesses, was what would make me a better protector." The prince listened intently, his breathing beginning to slow slightly. "Your grandfather then assigned Sir William, the captain of the guard at the time, to work with me. Not just on my fighting skills, but on learning to take care of myself, to recognize when I needed help, and to understand that asking for support wasn't failure. It was necessary for success. Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. I learned that true strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up when you do fall and being smart enough to accept the hands that reach out to help you. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, processing what Marcus had said. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was still shaky but held a note of hope. Do you really think there's a way to get through this? To become the leader everyone expects me to be? I think there's a way to become the leader you want to be, Marcus replied. And I think it starts with taking care of yourself and letting others help you carry the load. The prince nodded slowly, and for the first time that morning, Marcus saw a glimmer of the determined young man he knew Alexander could be. What do I need to do? Alexander asked. Marcus smiled, feeling a surge of pride for the prince's courage. First, we're going to get you something to eat, something small and easy on your stomach. Then we're going to talk to some people who can help you learn to manage these feelings and develop healthier ways of dealing with stress. But what about the court? What about my father? We'll handle that together, Marcus promised. One step at a time. Your father loves you, Alexander, and he wants you to be healthy and strong, not perfect. As for the court, they don't need to know the details of your personal struggles. What they need to see is a prince who is learning to be a wise and thoughtful leader. Alexander took a deep breath, the first truly steady one Marcus had seen him take all morning. Okay, I trust you, Marcus. You've always looked out for me. And I always will, the captain replied. But now I want to teach you to look out for yourself too. As Marcus helped the prince to his feet and guided him toward the wash basin to freshen up, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was about more than protecting Alexander from physical threats. This was about helping him develop the inner strength and resilience he would need not just as a future king, but as a human being. The journey ahead would not be easy, but Marcus was confident that with the right support and guidance, Prince Alexander could overcome his struggles and emerge as an even stronger leader than anyone imagined. The real crown, Marcus realized, was not the golden circlet Alexander would wear at his coronation, but the wisdom and self-awareness he would gain through facing and conquering his inner demons. As they prepared to face the day together, both Marcus and Alexander felt something they had not experienced in months: hope. 3 days had passed since Marcus had found Prince Alexander in the depths of his anxiety attack, and the captain had spent every waking moment carefully orchestrating a plan to help the young prince without causing a scandal at court. The delicate balance of protecting Alexander's privacy while ensuring he received the help he needed required all of Marcus's years of political navigation and strategic thinking. The first challenge had been convincing King Robert, Alexander's father, that his son needed support without revealing the full extent of the prince's struggles. Marcus had requested a private audience with the king, something that was not unusual given his position as head of the royal guard. What was unusual was the personal nature of his request. King Robert Blackthorne was a man in his late 40s, with the same dark hair as his son, but with more pronounced silver threading through it. He had ruled Aldoria for nearly 20 years with wisdom and compassion, but like many parents in positions of power, he sometimes struggled to see his children's needs beyond their royal duties. Your Majesty, Marcus had begun, standing at attention in the king's private study, I would like to request permission to work more closely with Prince Alexander over the coming weeks, particularly in regard to his physical and mental preparation for the coronation. King Robert looked up from the documents he had been reviewing, his brow furrowed slightly. Is there some concern about Alexander's readiness? His tutors have reported that his academic preparation is exemplary, though they have mentioned he seems somewhat distracted lately. Marcus chose his words carefully. Your son is an exceptional young man, Your Majesty, but he is carrying a heavy burden. The pressure of the upcoming coronation and the weight of his future responsibilities are affecting him more than he has let on. I believe he would benefit from additional support and guidance during this transition period. The king set down his quill and studied Marcus's face. You've known Alexander since he was a child, Marcus. If you're concerned, then I trust your judgment. What do you propose? I would like to arrange for Prince Alexander to work with Master Alina Brightwater, the healer who specializes in what she calls ailments of the mind and spirit. I would also like to modify his daily schedule to include more physical activity and time for personal reflection. Most importantly, I would like to serve as a mentor to him during this period, helping him develop the personal strength that will serve him well as a future king. King Robert was quiet for a long moment, processing Marcus's carefully worded request. You believe my son is struggling with his mental health. I believe your son is a thoughtful and sensitive young man who is taking his responsibilities very seriously, perhaps too seriously for his own well-being, Marcus replied diplomatically. With the right support, he will emerge from this period stronger and more capable than ever. The king nodded slowly. Very well. I place Alexander's welfare in your hands, Marcus. You have my complete trust and authority to do whatever you believe is necessary. Just keep me informed of his progress. Of course, Your Majesty. Thank you for your understanding. Now, 3 days later, Marcus was walking through the castle gardens with Alexander, beginning the first phase of what he hoped would be a comprehensive recovery plan. The morning sun filtered through the leaves of the ancient oak trees that had stood on the castle grounds for centuries, creating dappled patterns of light and shadow on the stone pathways. Alexander looked better than he had 3 days ago, though the improvement was subtle. His clothes still hung loosely on his frame, and the dark circles under his eyes remained prominent, but there was a slight straightening to his shoulders and a bit more color in his cheeks. More importantly, he had managed to eat a full breakfast that morning, the first complete meal he had finished in over a week. Master Alina will be joining us this afternoon, Marcus informed the prince as they walked. She's not like the court physicians. She specializes in helping people work through difficult emotions and develop better ways of managing stress. Alexander nodded, though Marcus could see the tension in his jaw. What will she want me to talk about? Whatever you're comfortable sharing, Marcus replied. But Alexander, I want you to understand something important. What you're experiencing, the anxiety, the difficulty eating, the overwhelming feelings, none of that is your fault, and none of it makes you weak or unfit to be king. The prince stopped walking and turned to face Marcus. But how can I lead others if I can't even control my own mind? It was a question Marcus had been expecting, and he had given considerable thought to his answer. Tell me, Your Highness, what do you think makes a good leader? Alexander seemed surprised by the question, but he considered it seriously. Someone who is strong, decisive, wise. Someone who can make difficult decisions and inspire others to follow them. Someone who puts the needs of their people before their own. All true, Marcus agreed. But you're missing something crucial. A good leader must also understand the struggles of their people. How can you have compassion for a farmer who is struggling to feed his family if you've never known what it's like to struggle yourself? How can you understand the fear and anxiety that your subjects face if you've never experienced those emotions? They resumed walking, passing by a fountain where several courtiers were engaged in quiet conversation. Marcus noticed how Alexander's posture stiffened slightly at their presence, and he made a mental note to address the prince's concerns about public perception. Your grandfather, King Edmund, once told me that his greatest strength as a leader came not from his victories, but from his failures and how he learned from them, Marcus continued. He said that the hardest battles he ever fought were not against enemy armies, but against his own fears and doubts. Grandfather struggled with things like this? Alexander asked, genuine surprise in his voice. Every great leader has, Marcus replied. The difference is that they learn to channel their struggles into wisdom and empathy. Your current difficulties are not obstacles to your future leadership, they're preparation for it. They found a quiet bench beneath a large willow tree, away from the more public areas of the garden. Marcus had chosen this spot deliberately, knowing that Alexander would feel more comfortable speaking openly without the risk of being overheard. Can you tell me more about when these feelings started? Marcus asked gently. Alexander was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I think it began about 6 months ago when Father started talking more seriously about the coronation. Suddenly, everything became about preparing me to be king. Every conversation, every lesson, every public appearance was viewed through the lens of how it would affect my future reign. The prince paused, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. At first, I felt honored by the responsibility. I wanted to prove myself worthy of the crown. But as time went on, the pressure just kept building. Every small mistake felt like a catastrophe. Every time someone looked at me, I wondered if they were judging whether I would be a good king. Marcus nodded, understanding. When did you start having trouble eating? It started gradually, Alexander admitted. First, I would just feel nervous before formal meals, especially when there were important guests. My stomach would be tied in knots and food just didn't appeal to me. Then it spread to other meals and eventually, well, you know how bad it got. And the panic attacks. The first one happened during a meeting with the trade ministers. They were discussing a complex economic issue, and I realized I didn't fully understand the implications of the policies they were proposing. I started thinking about how, as king, I would be responsible for making decisions that could affect thousands of lives, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. I had to excuse myself from the meeting. Alexander's voice became quieter. After that, it started happening more frequently. Anytime I felt overwhelmed or unprepared, my body would just rebel against me. The fear of having another attack in public made everything worse. Marcus felt a surge of anger, not at Alexander, but at the system that had placed such enormous pressure on a young man who was still learning to navigate the world. While he understood the importance of preparing the prince for his future role, it was clear that the approach had been causing more harm than good. "Alexander, I want you to understand something," Marcus said firmly. "You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to know everything at 17 that your father knows at 47. Leadership is a skill that develops over time with experience and guidance." "But what if I make mistakes that hurt people?" Alexander asked, his voice filled with genuine anguish. "Then you'll learn from those mistakes and do better next time," Marcus replied. "That's what every king before you has done. The greatest leaders in history are not remembered for their perfection. They're remembered for their growth, their resilience, and their ability to learn from their experiences." Just then, a figure approached them along the garden path. Master Elena Brightwater was a woman in her early 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple braid. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years helping others navigate their most difficult moments. "Your Highness," she said with a respectful bow, "Captain Thorne, thank you for allowing me to join you this afternoon." Alexander stood nervously, but Marcus remained seated, hopping to keep the atmosphere as informal as possible. "Master Elena, please join us. We were just discussing some of the challenges that Prince Alexander has been facing." Elena settled onto the bench beside them, her manner warm but professional. "Your Highness, before we begin, I want you to know that everything we discuss will remain completely confidential. My only goal is to help you develop the tools and strategies you need to manage stress and anxiety in healthy ways." "Captain Thorne tells me you specialize in ailments of the mind," Alexander said hesitantly. "I prefer to think of it as helping people understand and work with their emotions rather than against them," Elena replied with a gentle smile. "What you're experiencing, the anxiety, the physical symptoms, the difficulty eating, these are your mind and body's way of telling you that something needs attention. Rather than seeing these as problems to be eliminated, we can learn to see them as signals that help guide us toward better balance." Over the next hour, Elena guided Alexander through a series of gentle questions and breathing exercises. Marcus watched as the prince gradually began to relax, his shoulders dropping and his breathing becoming deeper and more regular. "One thing I want you to understand," Elena said as their session began to wind down, "is that anxiety often affects people who care deeply about doing well. It's not a character flaw, it's actually a sign of your commitment to being the best person and leader you can be. The challenge is learning to channel that caring nature in ways that support rather than undermine your well-being." "How do I do that?" Alexander asked. "We'll work on it together step by step," Elena assured him. "Today, I want you to practice one simple technique. When you start to feel overwhelmed, I want you to take 5 slow, deep breaths and then ask yourself this question: what is one small thing I can do right now to take care of myself? Sometimes the answer might be drinking a glass of water. Sometimes it might be stepping outside for fresh air. Sometimes it might be reaching out to Captain Thorne or another trusted person for support." As Elena prepared to leave, she handed Alexander a small journal. "I'd also like you to try writing down your thoughts and feelings each day. Not for anyone else to read, just for you. Sometimes putting our worries on paper can help us see them more clearly and reduce their power over us." After Elena departed, Marcus and Alexander sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter through the leaves. "I feel lighter somehow," Alexander said finally. "Like maybe this isn't impossible after all." "It's not impossible," Marcus confirmed. "It's going to take time and effort, but you're not alone in this journey. We're going to take it one day at a time, one step at a time. That evening, as Marcus made his final rounds through the castle, he stopped by Alexander's chambers one last time. Through the slightly open door, he could see the prince sitting at his desk, writing in the journal Alina had given him. The sight filled Marcus with cautious optimism. The road to recovery would be long, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks along the way. But for the first time in months, both Marcus and Alexander had reason to believe that the future held promise rather than just pressure. The young prince was beginning to learn that true strength came not from perfection, but from the courage to face one's vulnerabilities and work toward healing. As Marcus headed to his own quarters, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. Alexander was starting to understand that asking for help was not a sign of weakness, and Marcus was rediscovering that his role as protector extended far beyond physical safety. Together, they were embarking on a journey that would reshape not just Alexander's approach to leadership, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be strong. 2 weeks had passed since Alexander had begun working with Master Alina, and while there had been some improvements, the journey toward healing was proving to be more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Some days were better than others, with Alexander managing to eat full meals and participate in his royal duties with something approaching his old confidence. Other days, however, the anxiety would return with a vengeance, leaving him unable to function and reinforcing his fears about his fitness to lead. Marcus had been carefully monitoring the prince's progress, adjusting their daily routine based on how Alexander was feeling. They had established a morning walk routine in the gardens, followed by a light breakfast, and then either lessons with his tutors or time spent learning practical leadership skills from various castle staff members. The afternoons were reserved for sessions with Master Alina, physical exercise, and personal time for reflection. The approach was working, but slowly, and Marcus was growing increasingly concerned about the approaching coronation ceremony. In just 2 weeks, hundreds of nobles and dignitaries from across the kingdom would gather to witness Alexander's official recognition as heir apparent. The pressure of that event loomed over every conversation and every small victory they achieved. On a particularly gray morning in early autumn, Marcus arrived at Alexander's chambers to find the prince had not left his room at all the previous day. The servants reported that he had refused all meals and had spent the entire day in bed with the curtains drawn. When Marcus knocked on the door, he was met with silence. Using his key, Marcus entered the room to find Alexander sitting on the floor in the corner, his knees drawn up to his chest and his arms wrapped around them. He looked even thinner than before, and his face had a hollow, defeated expression that sent alarm bells ringing in Marcus's mind. "Alexander," Marcus called softly, approaching slowly as he had learned to do during these episodes. The prince looked up, and Marcus was shocked to see that his eyes were completely vacant, as if Alexander had retreated so far inside himself that he was barely present. When he spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. "I can't do it, Marcus. I've tried, but I can't. Every time I think I'm getting better, something happens that reminds me how inadequate I am. Yesterday, I couldn't even remember the names of the trade ministers I've been working with for months. How can I be king if I can't remember the people I'm supposed to be working with?" Marcus knelt down beside the prince, his heart breaking at the despair in the young man's voice. "Alexander, you are having a panic attack. It's completely normal for memory and concentration to be affected when your anxiety is high. That doesn't mean you're inadequate." "Doesn't it?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about it all night and I've realized something. Maybe everyone would be better off if I just gave up the throne. Let my cousin Edward inherit instead. He's older, more experienced, and he doesn't fall apart every time something goes wrong." The suggestion sent a chill through Marcus. He had seen soldiers reach this point before, the moment when they decided that the battle was too hard and that surrender was the only option. It was a critical moment that could determine the entire course of Alexander's future. "Is that really what you want?" Marcus asked carefully. "Or is that what your anxiety is telling you want?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know anymore. I can't tell the difference between what I really think and what the fear is telling me." Marcus recognized this as a crucial moment in Alexander's healing journey. The prince had reached what Master Alina had warned them about, the point where the old patterns of thinking would fight hardest against change. It was often the darkest moment before breakthrough, but it was also the most dangerous. Alexander, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. What you're experiencing right now is what Master Alina calls the anxiety's last stand. When we start to get better, when we start to develop new ways of thinking and being, the old patterns fight back harder than ever. They try to convince us that we're hopeless, that we should give up, that we'll never change. The prince looked up at Marcus with a flicker of interest. She mentioned that might happen. The question is, do you trust that voice, or do you trust the progress you've already made? Marcus asked. Because despite what you're feeling right now, you have made progress. 2 weeks ago, you couldn't eat a full meal. Yesterday, even though you were struggling, you managed to have breakfast before the anxiety took over. 2 weeks ago, you couldn't talk about your feelings at all. Right now, you're telling me exactly what's going on in your mind. Alexander considered this, and Marcus could see a tiny shift in his expression. I hadn't thought of it that way. The anxiety wants you to focus only on the setbacks and ignore the victories, Marcus continued. But healing isn't a straight line. It's more like climbing a mountain with many peaks and valleys. Just because you're in a valley right now doesn't mean you're back at the bottom. Over the next hour, Marcus stayed with Alexander, not trying to fix or solve anything, but simply being present while the prince worked through his feelings. Gradually, Alexander's posture began to relax, and some of the life returned to his eyes. I'm scared about the coronation, Alexander admitted finally. What if I have a panic attack during the ceremony? What if everyone sees that I'm not ready to be king? Then we'll handle it together, Marcus replied. But Alexander, I want you to consider something. What if, instead of trying to hide your struggles, you use them to become the kind of leader this kingdom has never had before? Alexander looked puzzled. What do you mean? I mean, what if your experience with anxiety and healing makes you more compassionate toward your subjects who are struggling? What if your journey teaches you humility and wisdom that a prince who never faced challenges could never possess? Before Alexander could respond, there was a gentle knock on the door. Master Alina entered, her face showing concern but not alarm. Marcus suspected she had been in communication with the servants and had come as soon as she learned about Alexander's difficult night. Good morning, Your Highness, she said warmly. Captain Thorne, I hope you don't mind me joining you. Actually, I'm glad you're here, Alexander said, surprising both Marcus and Alina. I think I'm ready to talk about something I haven't been able to discuss before. Alina settled into a chair across from where Alexander and Marcus were sitting. What would you like to talk about? The real reason I'm so terrified of becoming king, Alexander said, his voice steady for the first time in days. It's not just about the responsibility or the pressure. It's about my grandfather. Marcus and Alina exchanged a glance. King Edmund, Alexander's grandfather, had been a legendary ruler who had led Aldoria through a devastating war and emerged victorious. He had died when Alexander was 12, and the prince had always spoken of him with reverence and admiration. Can you tell us more about that? Alina encouraged gently. Alexander took a deep breath. Everyone always talks about how great-grandfather was, how strong and brave and wise, but what they don't talk about is how he died. I was there in his final days, and I saw something that no one else did. He paused, gathering courage to continue. He was in terrible pain, not just physically, but emotionally. He kept talking about all the mistakes he had made, all the people who had died because of his decisions. He was haunted by the weight of the crown, and he died feeling like he had failed. The revelation hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Alexander's fear wasn't just about living up to his grandfather's legacy. It was about the fear of ending up like him, crushed under the weight of responsibility. He made me promise, Alexander continued, his voice breaking slightly, that I would be better than him, that I would find a way to be king without letting it destroy me the way it destroyed him. But how can I keep that promise when I'm already falling apart before I've even been crowned? Alina leaned forward, her voice full of compassion. Alexander, what you witnessed was incredibly difficult, and it makes perfect sense that it would affect how you view leadership. But I want you to consider something. Your grandfather didn't have the tools and understanding that we have now. He didn't have people like Captain Thorne looking out for his emotional well-being, and he didn't have access to the kind of support we're providing you. More than that, Marcus added, your grandfather's pain came from carrying his burdens alone. You don't have to do that. You already have a support system in place, and part of learning to be a good leader is learning to use that support effectively. Alexander was quiet for a long time, processing this new perspective. Finally, he spoke again. What if I tried to see this differently? What if, instead of trying to be the perfect king grandfather wanted me to be, I tried to be the kind of king who could have helped him? Elena smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her in weeks. That sounds like the beginning of a very wise approach to leadership. What would that kind of king look like? Someone who wasn't afraid to admit when he needed help, Alexander said slowly. Someone who surrounded himself with good people and actually listened to them. Someone who understood that taking care of himself wasn't selfish, but necessary for taking care of his people. Someone who knew that strength came from vulnerability, not from hiding it, Marcus added. Over the rest of the morning, the three of them worked together to develop what Alina called a new narrative for Alexander's future. Instead of seeing his struggles as obstacles to leadership, they reframed them as preparation for a different kind of leadership, one based on empathy, wisdom, and genuine connection with his people. They also developed a concrete plan for managing the coronation ceremony. Alexander would have specific people assigned to watch for signs that he was becoming overwhelmed, and there would be predetermined signals and escape plans if he needed a break. Most importantly, they decided that if Alexander did have difficulties during the ceremony, they would be honest about it rather than trying to cover it up. Your people will respect honesty far more than they'll respect a facade of perfection, Alina told him. And if they see their future king dealing with challenges with grace and wisdom, it will give them hope for how he'll handle the challenges of leadership. By the afternoon, Alexander was feeling well enough to join Marcus for their usual walk in the gardens. As they walked, Marcus noticed a fundamental change in the prince's demeanor. While he still looked tired and worn from his struggles, there was a new sense of purpose in his step and a clarity in his eyes that had been missing before. Marcus, Alexander said as they paused by their favorite bench, I want to thank you for not giving up on me, even when I was ready to give up on myself. You never gave up, Marcus replied. You just lost sight of your own strength for a while. The fact that you're still here, still fighting, still willing to grow, that's what real courage looks like. As they sat in the dappled sunlight, both men felt a sense of cautious optimism about the future. The coronation was still approaching, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. But Alexander was no longer facing those challenges alone, and more importantly, he was beginning to understand that his struggles didn't disqualify him from leadership. They were preparing him for a better kind of leadership than anyone had imagined possible. The breaking point had become a breakthrough, and both Marcus and Alexander knew that everything that came next would be built on a foundation of truth, courage, and the understanding that real strength comes from facing our vulnerabilities with support and wisdom. The week before the coronation brought an unexpected test that would prove whether Alexander had truly learned to apply his new understanding of strength and leadership, or whether the old patterns of fear and perfectionism still held power over him. It began on a crisp morning when Marcus was summoned to an urgent meeting with King Robert. The king's study was filled with several members of the royal council, their faces grave and their postures tense. Marcus immediately sensed that something significant had happened. Captain Thorne, King Robert began without preamble, we have received disturbing reports from the northern border. A group of bandits has been attacking merchant caravans, and yesterday they struck a village just inside our territory. 3 people were killed, and several others were injured. Lord Chancellor Aldrich, an elderly man with sharp features and sharper political instincts, leaned forward. The situation requires immediate attention, Your Majesty. The people need to see that the crown will protect them, especially with the coronation so close at hand. What kind of response are you considering? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew where the conversation was heading. We need to send a force to deal with these bandits decisively, declared Sir Edmund Carfield, the Master of Arms. I recommend 100 armed men, led by yourself, Captain, with orders to capture or eliminate the threat. King Robert nodded slowly. I agree that we must respond, but I want Alexander to accompany the mission as an observer. It's time for him to see real leadership in action, to understand the weight of making decisions that affect people's lives. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Sending Alexander on a military mission, especially in his current state of emotional fragility, seemed like exactly the wrong thing to do. But he also recognized that refusing the king's direct order would require explanations that could compromise Alexander's privacy and recovery. Your Majesty, Marcus said carefully, Prince Alexander has been working very hard on his preparations for the coronation. Perhaps this close to the ceremony, it would be better to keep his focus on those responsibilities. Lord Chancellor Aldrich's eyes narrowed slightly. Captain Thorne, with respect, the prince's preparation must include understanding the realities of leadership. What lesson does it send if he hides in the castle while others deal with the kingdom's problems? Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock on the study door. To everyone's surprise, Prince Alexander entered, having been summoned by a servant who had found him in the library. "Father," Alexander said, bowing respectfully, "you wish to see me." King Robert's expression softened as he looked at his son. Alexander appeared much better than he had a week ago, but Marcus could see the subtle signs of tension around his eyes and the slight stiffness in his posture that indicated he was working hard to maintain his composure. "Alexander, we have a situation that requires our attention," the king explained, describing the bandit attacks and the planned response. "I want you to accompany Captain Thorne and observe how we handle such crises. It will be valuable experience for you." Marcus watched Alexander's face carefully and saw several emotions flicker across it: fear, uncertainty, but also something that looked like determination. When Alexander spoke, his voice was steady. "I understand the importance of learning about these situations, Father. May I ask what my specific role would be in this mission?" "You would observe and learn," Lord Chancellor Aldrich interjected before the king could respond. "This would be an excellent opportunity for you to see decisive leadership in action, to understand how a future king must be prepared to make difficult decisions quickly and without hesitation." Marcus noted the implicit criticism in Aldrich's words and suspected that the Chancellor had been hearing rumors about Alexander's recent struggles. The political implications of the situation were becoming clearer. This wasn't just about dealing with bandits. It was about testing Alexander's readiness to lead. "When would we depart?" Alexander asked, and Marcus was surprised by the calmness in his voice. "This afternoon," Sir Edmund replied. "Time is crucial in these matters. Every day we delay gives the bandits more opportunity to strike again." Alexander nodded slowly. "Father, might I have a few minutes to speak with Captain Thorne privately before we depart? I want to understand the tactical aspects of the mission." King Robert agreed, and the meeting was adjourned with plans for departure in 4 hours. As the other council members filed out, Marcus and Alexander were left alone with the king. "Alexander," King Robert said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, "I know this is sudden, but I believe you're ready for this responsibility. You've grown so much over the past year." "Thank you for your confidence in me, Father," Alexander replied. "I won't let you down." After the king left, Marcus and Alexander walked in silence back to Alexander's chambers. Once inside with the door closed, Marcus braced himself for panic, tears, or any of the other responses Alexander had shown to overwhelming situations in the past. Instead, Alexander sat down calmly and looked directly at Marcus. "This is a test, isn't it?" Alexander said. "Not just of whether I can handle a military situation, but of whether I'm really ready to be king." Marcus was impressed by Alexander's insight. "Yes, I believe it is. How are you feeling about it?" "Terrified," Alexander admitted with a slight smile. "But not in the same way I was terrified before. This time I understand what the fear is telling me, and I can choose what to do with it." "What is it telling you?" "That this situation is serious and that people's lives are at stake. That I need to be prepared and thoughtful, not reckless or impulsive. That I need to rely on the people around me who have more experience." Alexander paused. "The old fear would have told me that I wasn't good enough, that I would fail, that everyone would see how inadequate I am. This fear is different. It's about caring about doing the right thing." Marcus felt a surge of pride and hope. "That's the difference between fear that paralyzes and fear that motivates. What do you think you need to do to prepare?" "I need to talk to Master Alina about managing my anxiety during the mission. I need to understand clearly what my role is and what's expected of me. And I need to remember that my job isn't to prove I'm the perfect future king. It's to learn and to support the mission in whatever way I can." Over the next 3 hours, Alexander, Marcus, and Master Alina worked together to prepare for the mission. They developed strategies for managing anxiety in high-stress situations, established signals for when Alexander might need support, and most importantly, reframed the mission as an opportunity for growth rather than a test to pass or fail. Remember, Alina told Alexander as they concluded their session, courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in alignment with your values despite the fear. Your value is protecting and serving your people. Let that guide your decisions. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, Alexander and Marcus joined the assembled force in the castle courtyard. 100 mounted soldiers waited in formation, their armor gleaming and their weapons ready. Alexander was dressed in practical riding clothes with light armor, looking every inch a prince but also clearly prepared for the realities of the mission. Lord Chancellor Aldrich approached them as they prepared to mount their horses. Prince Alexander, I hope you understand the significance of this mission. The people will be watching to see how the royal family responds to threats against the kingdom. Alexander met the Chancellor's gaze steadily. I understand, Lord Aldrich. I also understand that my role is to observe, learn, and support Captain Thorne's leadership in whatever way is most helpful. Marcus noted the subtle but important distinction Alexander was making. He wasn't positioning himself as the leader of the mission, but as a participant who was there to learn and contribute appropriately. The ride to the northern border took the better part of 2 days, with the force camping overnight in a secure location. During the journey, Marcus was amazed by Alexander's composure and engagement. Instead of withdrawing into anxiety, the prince spent time talking with the soldiers, learning about their experiences and concerns. He helped with camp duties, sharing in the work rather than expecting special treatment. On the second evening, as they sat around a small campfire, one of the younger soldiers approached Alexander hesitantly. Your Highness, the soldier said, might I ask you something? Of course, Alexander replied. Some of us were wondering, are you nervous about your coronation, about becoming king someday? Marcus tensed, unsure how Alexander would respond to such a personal question, but Alexander considered the question seriously before answering. Yes, I am nervous, he said honestly. I think anyone who truly understands the responsibility of leadership would be nervous about it. The crown isn't just a symbol of power, it's a commitment to serve others, sometimes at great personal cost. But how do you deal with that fear? Another soldier asked. I'm still learning, Alexander admitted. But I've discovered that fear can be a teacher if you listen to it carefully. It can tell you what matters most to you and help you prepare to protect those things. The key is not letting fear control your actions, but using it to motivate you to become stronger and wiser. Marcus listened to this conversation with growing amazement. The young man who, just weeks ago, had been unable to eat or leave his room due to anxiety, was now offering wisdom and comfort to hardened soldiers. The transformation wasn't complete. Marcus could still see signs of stress in Alexander's posture and breathing, but the prince was clearly applying everything he had learned. The next morning, they reached the area where the bandits had been operating. Marcus deployed scouts and established a perimeter while Alexander observed the process with keen attention. When the scouts reported that they had located the bandit camp, Marcus called a meeting of his senior officers to plan their approach. We have several options, Marcus explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt. We can attempt to surround them and force surrender, we can attack directly to eliminate the threat quickly, or we can try to negotiate. What do you recommend, Captain? Asked Lieutenant Torres, one of Marcus's most trusted officers. Before Marcus could answer, Alexander spoke up. Might I ask a question about the intelligence we've gathered? Marcus nodded, curious to see where Alexander's mind was going. Do we know anything about why these people turned to banditry? Were they driven to it by desperation, or are they simply criminals seeking easy profit? It was an insightful question that went to the heart of the situation. Lieutenant Torres answered, From what we've learned, sir, most of them appear to be former farmers whose crops failed last season. They turned to this because they were facing starvation. Alexander looked thoughtful. Then perhaps there's a fourth option to consider. What if we offered them a choice, face justice for their crimes, but also offered them legitimate work and support to rebuild their lives? The officers looked surprised by the suggestion, but Marcus could see the wisdom in it. It addressed not just the immediate threat, but the underlying problem that had created the situation. That's actually not a bad idea, Lieutenant Torres said slowly. If we can solve the root cause, we prevent future incidents. Marcus smiled, recognizing that Alexander had just demonstrated exactly the kind of thoughtful, compassionate leadership that the kingdom needed. What would such an approach look like in practice? Together, the group developed a plan that combined strength with mercy. They would surround the bandit camp and offer terms. Those who surrendered would face reduced sentences and be offered work in the royal road-building projects that were planned for the spring. Those who chose to fight would be dealt with according to military justice. The plan worked perfectly. Faced with overwhelming force but also a genuine offer of redemption, most of the bandits chose to surrender. Only a few die-hard criminals chose to fight, and they were quickly subdued with minimal bloodshed. As they prepared for the journey back to the castle, Marcus found Alexander sitting alone, looking thoughtful. "How are you feeling about how things went?" Marcus asked. "Proud but also humbled," Alexander replied. "I'm proud that we found a solution that addressed the real problem, but humbled by how much I still have to learn about leadership." "What did you learn?" "That good leadership isn't about having all the answers or being the strongest person in the room. It's about asking the right questions and being willing to consider solutions that others might not think of." Alexander paused. "I also learned that my anxiety and sensitivity aren't weaknesses to overcome. They're part of what helps me think about problems differently." As they rode back toward the castle, Marcus reflected on the remarkable transformation he had witnessed. Alexander had faced his first real test of leadership under pressure and had not just survived, but excelled. More importantly, he had done so while remaining true to the values and insights he had developed through his struggles with anxiety and self-doubt. The coronation was just days away, but Marcus was no longer worried about whether Alexander was ready. The prince had proven that his struggles had prepared him for a different kind of leadership, one based on wisdom, compassion, and the understanding that true strength comes from facing our challenges with courage and support. The test had become a triumph, and both Marcus and Alexander knew that they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning of the coronation dawned clear and bright, with golden sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the castle and casting rainbow patterns through the stained glass. The entire kingdom had been preparing for this day for months, and now the moment had finally arrived when Prince Alexander would be officially recognized as heir apparent to the throne of Aldoria. Alexander stood before the mirror in his chambers, dressed in the ceremonial robes that had been worn by future kings for generations. The deep blue velvet was embroidered with silver thread in intricate patterns that told the history of the kingdom, and the weight of the fabric seemed to symbolize the weight of responsibility he was about to formally accept. But unlike the morning Marcus had found him in crisis just a month ago, Alexander's reflection showed a young man who had been fundamentally transformed by his journey through struggle toward healing. His posture was straight but relaxed. His breathing was calm and steady, and most importantly, his eyes held a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had faced his deepest fears and emerged stronger. Marcus entered the chambers, resplendent in his dress uniform as captain of the royal guard. The bond between them had deepened far beyond the traditional relationship between protector and prince. They had become true partners in leadership, with Marcus serving not just as a guard, but as a mentor and trusted advisor. "How are you feeling, Your Highness?" Marcus asked, though he could already see from Alexander's demeanor that the answer would be very different from what it might have been a month ago. "Nervous but ready," Alexander replied honestly. "The nervousness feels different now. It's not the paralyzing fear I used to experience. It's the kind of nervousness that comes from truly understanding the significance of what I'm about to commit to." Alexander turned from the mirror to face Marcus directly. "I want to thank you, Marcus, for everything you've done over these past weeks. You saved my life, but more than that, you helped me discover who I really am and who I want to become as a leader." Marcus felt a deep warmth in his chest. "You saved yourself, Alexander. I just provided some guidance along the way. Everything you've accomplished, every breakthrough you've had, came from your own courage and determination." "Still," Alexander insisted, "I couldn't have done it alone. And that's something I want to remember throughout my reign, that the strongest leaders are those who surround themselves with good people and aren't afraid to rely on their wisdom and support." There was a gentle knock on the door, and Master Alina entered, carrying a small wooden box. "Good morning, Your Highness, Captain Thorne. I wanted to give you this before the ceremony begins." She handed the box to Alexander, who opened it to reveal a simple silver ring, engraved with a phrase in the old language. Alexander read it aloud, translating as he went. Strength through wisdom, wisdom through struggle. I had it made to commemorate your journey, Alina explained. Not as a reminder of the difficulties you've faced, but as a symbol of the wisdom and strength you've gained through facing those difficulties with courage. Alexander slipped the ring onto his finger, next to the signet ring that marked his royal status. Thank you, Alina. This means more to me than I can express. As the morning progressed, the castle filled with hundreds of nobles, dignitaries, and citizens who had come to witness the ceremony. The Great Hall had been transformed into a magnificent venue, with banners representing every region of the kingdom hanging from the rafters and fresh flowers adorning every surface. King Robert appeared at Alexander's chambers an hour before the ceremony was to begin. The king looked magnificent in his royal robes, the crown of Aldoria resting regally on his head, but his expression was that of a proud and loving father. "My son," King Robert said, embracing Alexander warmly, "I cannot tell you how proud I am of the man you have become. The kingdom is fortunate to have you as its future king." "Thank you, father," Alexander replied. "I hope to prove worthy of your confidence and the crown I will someday wear." "You already have," the king assured him. "But Alexander, I want you to know that becoming heir apparent doesn't mean you have to carry your burdens alone. The crown is heavy, but it was never meant to be worn without support." As they made their way to the Great Hall, Alexander felt a calmness that surprised him. The techniques he had learned for managing anxiety were working, but more importantly, he had fundamentally changed his relationship with fear and pressure. Instead of seeing them as enemies to be defeated, he now understood them as signals that could guide him toward better decisions and deeper wisdom. The ceremony itself was magnificent. The Great Hall was packed with guests, their finest clothes creating a sea of rich colors and gleaming jewels. At the front of the hall stood an ornate throne, temporarily empty, with steps leading up to a platform where King Robert would conduct the ceremony. As Alexander walked down the center aisle, he was acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes upon him. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt connected to each person present. These were his people, the citizens he was committing to serve, and their presence felt like a source of strength rather than pressure. When he reached the platform, Alexander knelt before his father as tradition dictated. King Robert's voice rang out clear and strong as he spoke the ancient words that had been used for this ceremony for centuries. "Prince Alexander Aldwin Blackthorn," the king began, "do you solemnly swear to uphold the laws and traditions of Aldoria, to protect and serve its people with wisdom and justice, and to accept the responsibilities of leadership with humility and strength?" "I do so swear," Alexander replied, his voice carrying clearly throughout the hall. "Do you promise to rule with compassion for the struggles of your people, with courage in the face of adversity, and with wisdom gained through both triumph and hardship?" This part of the ceremony was new, added at Alexander's own request. He had wanted to acknowledge explicitly that leadership required understanding of struggle, not just success. "I do so promise," Alexander said, thinking of the farmers they had helped just days before, of the soldiers who had shared their fears with him, and of his own journey through darkness toward light. King Robert lifted the ceremonial circlet that would mark Alexander as heir apparent. Unlike the full crown that he would wear as king, this was a simpler band of gold, but it carried just as much meaning. "Then by the authority of the throne of Aldoria, and with the blessing of our ancestors, I name you heir apparent to the kingdom of Aldoria. May you wear this crown with wisdom, and may wisdom guide you toward true strength." As the circlet was placed on Alexander's head, the hall erupted in applause and cheers. Alexander rose and turned to face the assembled crowd, feeling the weight of the gold band, but also feeling lighter than he had in months. But the most meaningful part of the ceremony came next, when Alexander was invited to address his people for the first time as heir apparent. This, too, had been his own addition to the traditional ceremony, because he wanted to share with his people the most important lessons he had learned. "My lords and ladies, citizens of Aldoria," Alexander began, his voice steady and clear, "today I accept not just a title, but a sacred trust. I promise to serve you with everything I have, but I also want to share with you something I have learned about what true service requires." The hall was completely silent, everyone straining to hear what their future king had to say. "I have learned that true strength does not come from having no weaknesses, but from acknowledging our weaknesses and working to grow stronger. I have learned that the best leaders are not those who never struggle, but those who learn from their struggles and use that wisdom to better serve others. Alexander's eyes found Marcus in the crowd, then Alina, then his father, drawing strength from their supportive presence. I have learned that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of wisdom. And I have learned that the greatest leaders are those who surround themselves with good people and have the humility to listen to their counsel. He paused, looking out at the faces of his people, farmers and merchants, nobles and servants, young and old. I promise you this, I will not pretend to be perfect because perfection is not what you need from your king. What you need is honesty, dedication, and a commitment to continuous growth and learning. You need a leader who understands that serving others sometimes requires serving yourself first, taking care of your own health and wisdom so that you can better care for others. The crowd was hanging on every word, many of them nodding in recognition of truths they had learned in their own lives. I promise to lead with both strength and humility, to make decisions based on wisdom rather than fear, and to remember always that the crown I wear is not a symbol of my power over you, but of my commitment to you. As Alexander concluded his speech, the applause was not just polite ceremony. It was genuine enthusiasm and approval. The people had heard something new in their future king's words, a maturity and wisdom that went beyond his years. Over the next several hours, the celebration continued with feasting and entertainment. Alexander moved through the crowds, speaking with nobles and commoners alike, and Marcus noted how naturally he connected with people. The prince's struggles with anxiety had taught him empathy and genuine interest in others' experiences. As the day drew toward evening, Alexander found himself in the castle gardens with Marcus, Alina, and his father, taking a few minutes of quiet reflection away from the crowds. "How do you feel?" Alina asked. "Complete," Alexander said after a moment's thought. "Not because I've achieved perfection or reached some final destination, but because I feel like I finally understand what my purpose is and how to pursue it." King Robert smiled at his son. "You know, Alexander, your grandfather would be so proud of the man you've become. But more than that, I think he would be relieved to see that you've learned lessons that took him a lifetime to understand." "What do you mean?" Alexander asked. "That leadership is not about carrying the weight of the world alone," King Robert explained. "Edmund died feeling like he had failed because he never learned to share his burdens, to trust others with his vulnerabilities. You've learned that lesson before you even begin to rule. That will make all the difference." As the sun set over the castle, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink, the four of them stood together in comfortable silence, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Marcus thought about how his role as protector had evolved into something far more meaningful. He had not just guarded Alexander's physical safety, but had helped guide his emotional and spiritual growth. The young man standing beside him now was not just ready to be king, but ready to be the kind of king that the kingdom had never had before. Alina reflected on Alexander's transformation with professional pride, but also personal affection. She had seen many people work through mental health challenges, but rarely had she seen someone use their struggles so effectively as a foundation for wisdom and leadership. King Robert looked at his son with a mixture of pride and relief. The weight of wondering whether Alexander would be ready to inherit the throne had been lifted, replaced by confidence that the kingdom's future was in capable hands. And Alexander himself felt something he had never expected, to feel peace with his own imperfections and excitement about the future. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt and difficulty, but he also knew that he had the tools and support system he needed to face those challenges with wisdom and strength. The coronation ceremony was over, but in many ways it marked not an ending but a beginning. Alexander was now officially heir apparent, but more importantly, he had become a young man who understood that true leadership comes from the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to seek help when needed, and the strength that comes from facing our fears with support and determination. As they headed back into the castle to rejoin the celebration, Marcus realized that he had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the coronation of a future king, but the birth of a new kind of leadership that would transform the kingdom for generations to come. The crown of gold that rested on Alexander's head was beautiful, but the crown of wisdom that he had earned through his struggles would prove to be far more valuable. and everyone who had been part of his journey knew that the best was yet to come.